My name is Lauren, 33 years old, and tonight I am collecting on a debt that has been accruing interest for a decade and a half. During the house fire 15 years ago, the smoke was so thick it burned my throat. I reached out for help, but my dad pushed me violently back into the flames and grabbed my little sister's hand instead. Through the roar of the fire, my mom coldly said they could not risk losing their little girl, and they left me to die. They had no idea I escaped the ashes. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to build an empire just to prove your toxic family wrong. The crystal chandeliers of the grand ballroom cast a warm golden light over the Chicago skyline, visible through massive floor-to-ceiling windows. Tonight was the most important political fundraising event of the season. Hundreds of the city elite gathered in their finest evening wear, clinking champagne flutes and discussing the upcoming state senate race. I walked through the heavy double doors wearing a custom emerald green gown. The strategic cut of the fabric gracefully exposed a faint jagged burn scar on my left shoulder. It was a scar I used to hide, but tonight it was my armor. I handed my coat to the valet and bypassed the main reception area, walking directly toward the velvet ropes guarding the VIP section. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor. I did not need to wait in line or ask for permission. I belonged in that room more than anyone else present. As I stepped past the heavy velvet curtains, the noise of the main ballroom faded into a sophisticated hum. And there they were. My parents, William and Catherine, were holding court near the private bar. They looked exactly as they always did. Polished, wealthy, and completely fake. William was laughing at a joke made by a prominent real estate developer while Catherine nodded along with her perfectly styled hair and practiced smile. They were playing the roles of the proud, supportive family of the candidate. I took sparkling water from a passing waiter and walked straight into their line of sight. Catherine saw me first. Her practiced smile froze, the color instantly drained from her perfectly powdered face. The crystal glass in her hand shook so violently that champagne sloshed over the rim and stained the cuff of William's expensive tuxedo. She dropped her glass and grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging painfully into my skin. Before I could say a word, she dragged me roughly behind a massive floral arrangement in the darkest corner of the VIP lounge. Her face twisted into a mask of pure horror and rage. She did not ask how I was alive. She did not pull me into a hug or shed a tear of relief. Her first instinct was pure venom. "You are alive!" she hissed, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. "You ungrateful brat! You ran away to live with street junkies and now you dare to show your ugly face here. You have some nerve crashing your brother-in-law's gala. This is the most important night of Donovan's political career. Leave right now before I have security throw you out on the street where you belong." I did not cry. I did not flinch. The scared teenager who used to beg for her approval had died in that fire 15 years ago. I calmly looked down at the drop of spilled champagne on my emerald dress and brushed it away with my bare hand. "Ran away," I replied, my voice steady and devoid of emotion. "Is that the pathetic story you sold to your high society friends?" Funny, I do not remember running anywhere. I remember choking on toxic black smoke. I remember dodging burning wooden rafters after Dad kicked me backward into the blazing stairwell so he could clear a path for his favorite child. Catherine stumbled back half a step. Her breathing grew shallow and her eyes darted frantically around the room to make sure no one had heard me. She opened her mouth to speak, but another voice cut through the tension. "What is going on here?" a shrill voice demanded. I turned to see my younger sister Courtney. She wore a stunning white gown that probably cost more than a car, her blonde hair styled in flawless waves. She stopped dead in her tracks when she recognized me. Her perfectly contoured face morphed into an ugly sneer. "What is she doing here?" Courtney demanded, glaring at our mother before turning her venomous gaze to me. "You are a broke, miserable failure who wants to drain our family of money. You are not ruining my husband's campaign. I am calling the guards right now and having you arrested for trespassing." Courtney raised her hand, signaling wildly toward the two massive men in dark suits standing near the entrance of the VIP suite. I simply smiled, the cold, calculated smile of a woman who held every single card in the deck. I slowly pulled my phone from my clutch, tapping the screen once to illuminate my banking application. I looked past my sister's shoulder. Approaching us from the far side of the room was Donovan. He was a tall, imposing African-American man with a sharp legal mind and an unyielding reputation as a former prosecutor. He was the golden ticket my family was using to elevate their social status. I locked eyes with my mother and sister. My voice dropped to a razor-sharp whisper as Donovan closed the distance between us. "Call them now," I told my mother, keeping my eyes fixed right on her terrified face. "But before you do, are you absolutely sure you want to throw out the majority donor of his super PAC?" Donovan stepped into the secluded VIP alcove just as the tension threatened to shatter the crystal centerpieces decorating the room. He was a man whose presence commanded immediate respect. A former federal prosecutor with a razor-sharp legal mind, Donovan had built his Senate campaign on a platform of absolute integrity and a relentless pursuit of the truth. He wore his tailored midnight blue suit with the easy confidence of a man who spent his life dismantling liars on the witness stand. Right now, his dark, calculating eyes were locked entirely on me. He ignored his wife, Courtney, whose face had gone chalk white, and bypassed Catherine, who was trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. Donovan stopped 2 feet away from me. He looked at the faint burn scar tracing my collarbone, then looked up to meet my gaze. He did not see a ghost or an ungrateful runaway. His analytical mind was already connecting the dots. He tilted his head slightly, his voice a low, commanding baritone that easily cut through the ambient noise of the gala outside where wealthy donors were busy writing checks for his political future. He addressed me directly, asking if I was the representative for LA Holdings. It was not a guess. It was an interrogation disguised as a polite inquiry. LA Holdings was the anonymous venture capital firm that had single-handedly kept his campaign afloat over the past 6 months. I held his gaze and nodded once. Before I could introduce myself properly, William crashed into our circle. My father was sweating through his bespoke tuxedo, his face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. He physically threw himself between Donovan and me, using his broad shoulders to block Donovan's view. William slapped a heavy hand onto Donovan's chest, forcing out a jovial, overly loud laugh that sounded like scraping metal. He told Donovan not to listen to a single word coming out of my mouth. He spun the narrative instantly, his voice dripping with venomous fake pity. William loudly declared that I was his deeply disturbed, mentally unstable, estranged daughter. He painted a tragic fictional masterpiece right there on the plush carpet. He told the rising political star that I was a drug-addicted grifter who had abandoned a loving family 15 years ago, breaking my poor mother's heart and leaving them with years of therapy bills. William leaned closer to Donovan, lowering his voice into a conspiratorial whisper, claiming that I had clearly hit rock bottom and crawled back to crash the most important night of their lives for a desperate shakedown, searching for an easy payout. He said I was here to extort them because I knew they had finally found success. Catherine immediately chimed in from the sidelines, playing the role of the traumatized matriarch flawlessly. She dabbed her dry eyes with a silk napkin, sobbing that I had caused them nothing but pain and ruin, and that my presence was an insult to their good name. They were desperately trying to build a wall of lies so thick that Donovan would simply call security and ask no further questions. I did not scream or raise my voice to defend myself. I just laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound that echoed off the gilded walls of the VIP lounge. The laugh stopped William dead in his tracks. He turned to me, his jaw clenching so hard a vein throbbed at his temple. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing William to either stand his ground or retreat. He took half a step back. I looked him dead in the eye and let 15 years of suppressed truth spill out into the open air, refusing to be the scapegoat any longer. "Extort you?" I asked, letting a mockingly sympathetic tone coat my words. "With what money, William? The money you did not have 15 years ago." Donovan watched the exchange with the silent intensity of a hawk watching a mouse. I kept my eyes locked on the man who had sired me, refusing to let him look away. I asked him if he remembered the absolute panic in his voice the night before the fire when the bank called to finalize the foreclosure on our childhood home. I reminded him loud enough for Donovan to hear every single syllable that he was drowning in millions of dollars of bad debt, facing multiple lawsuits from unpaid contractors, and staring down the barrel of total financial ruin. I told him it was a remarkable stroke of luck that our house went up in flames the very next evening, saving him from the humiliation of bankruptcy. William's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Catherine gasped, clutching her diamond necklace, as if I had physically struck her. Courtney tried to run interference, grabbing Donovan's arm and tugging him toward the exit. She begged him to leave the room, insisting that I was having a psychotic break and needed to be institutionalized before I caused a permanent scandal for his campaign. But Donovan planted his feet firmly on the floor, shrugging off his wife's frantic grasp. His prosecutor instincts were fully activated now. He ignored the panicked protests of his in-laws and looked straight at me, his gaze intense and demanding. He asked William to step aside. Then Donovan asked me to clarify exactly what I meant about LA Holdings and the campaign funding. He wanted to know exactly who he was dealing with. I reached into my sleek designer clutch and pulled out a slim black iPad. I unlocked the screen with my fingerprint and calmly handed it to Donovan. I told him he should probably review the corporate asset structure of his biggest donor before he let his father-in-law kick me out. Donovan took the tablet, his eyes scanning the glowing screen. His expression shifted from professional curiosity to absolute shock. The document displayed the holding company's massive portfolio. I watched his eyes track down the list of assets until he stopped at the bottom. I told him I did not just fund the political action committee that was currently paying for his entire senatorial run. I smiled, savoring the absolute terror radiating from my family, and informed Donovan that my real estate firm actually owned the very hotel we were standing in, meaning I could have them all thrown out onto the street with a single gesture. Donovan stared at the glowing screen of the tablet, his prosecutor instincts warring with the chaotic reality unfolding in front of him. The silence in our secluded VIP corner was deafening, broken only by the muffled bass of the gala band playing in the main ballroom. Before Donovan could process the magnitude of the financial portfolio illuminating his face, Courtney launched her counterattack. She had spent a lifetime perfecting the role of the delicate, traumatized victim, and she slipped into the character with flawless precision. She let out a sharp, breathless sob, her hands flying to her face to catch tears that materialized on command. Courtney threw herself against Donovan, her fingers clutching the sleeve of his midnight blue suit like a drowning woman clinging to a life raft. She buried her face against his shoulder, her voice shaking with manufactured terror. She begged him not to look at my screen, claiming I had probably forged the documents to trick him. She cried that I had been obsessed with ruining her life since we were teenagers, and that my sudden appearance tonight was just another sick, twisted game. She pleaded with him to call security, demanding he throw me out before I destroyed the most important night of his political career. Donovan placed a steadying hand on his wife's waist, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. He was a man built on logic and hard facts, currently trapped in a hurricane of emotional manipulation. He tried to de-escalate the situation, his voice dropping to a calm, authoritative register. He gently asked Courtney to take a deep breath, suggesting that we all sit down in a private boardroom upstairs to sort through these allegations rationally. He looked at me, attempting to establish a mediator's rapport, asking if I would be willing to pause the public spectacle to review the legal ownership documents in a controlled environment. I did not move a single muscle. I stood my ground, my emerald gown pooling around my heels, my posture radiating absolute defiance. I told Donovan there would be no private meetings and no quiet mediations. I reminded him that my family had thrived in the shadows for 15 years, hiding their sins behind closed doors, and I was not going to give them the luxury of secrecy ever again. I reached out and calmly pulled my tablet from his hands, locking the screen with a sharp click. Courtney snapped. The delicate weeping victim routine vanished the moment she realized Donovan was not going to blindly summon his guards to drag me away. She stepped out from behind her husband, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure spite. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger right at my chest. She screamed that I was nothing but a broke, pathetic loser who could not handle the fact that she had won at life. She practically spat the words detailing her lavish lifestyle, her expensive home, her powerful husband, and her flawless social circle. She yelled that I was a jealous outcast who had crawled out of the gutter to try and ruin their wealthy, perfect existence because I had absolutely nothing to show for my own miserable life. William and Catherine nodded aggressively behind her, emboldened by Courtney's vitriol. Catherine crossed her arms, her diamond bracelets clinking together, and sneered that I was making a fool of myself. She told Donovan I was likely living in a shelter using fake corporate names to terrorize them, and that he should have me arrested for fraud immediately. I let Courtney finish her tirade. I let the echoes of her screaming bounce off the crystal chandeliers above us. I looked at the three of them standing together in their expensive clothes, wrapped in their arrogant delusions of superiority. Then I looked at Donovan, who was watching his wife's unhinged outburst with growing concern. I raised my phone so Courtney could see the screen. I smiled, letting a cold, unforgiving edge slip into my voice. I told her we should see exactly how wealthy they really were. I opened the encrypted portal to my venture capital firm. With 2 deliberate taps of my thumb, I bypassed the security protocols on the Political Action Committee accounts. I initiated an immediate and total freeze on all outgoing funds, effectively crippling the financial lifeblood of Donovan's campaign and halting every single transaction tied to William's associated accounts. I locked the screen and dropped the phone back into my clutch. William scoffed, puffing out his chest and adjusting his silk bow tie. He told Donovan I was playing parlor tricks with a cell phone and that his campaign money was perfectly safe in the family trust. He clapped Donovan on the shoulder aggressively, assuring him that the family had limitless resources and that my little display was nothing but empty theatrics from a desperate woman. The heavy velvet curtains of the VIP alcove parted. A young man wearing a headset and a frantic expression burst into our secluded circle. It was Donovan's chief event organizer, and he was sweating profusely. He did not seem to notice the suffocating tension or Courtney's tear-stained face. He zeroed in on my father holding a small black leather billfold like it was a live grenade. The organizer apologized for interrupting the private family moment, his voice cracking with panic. He stepped directly up to William and held out the billfold. He nervously announced that there was a massive problem with the primary accounts. He swallowed hard, looking around the circle before fixing his eyes on my father's suddenly pale face. He stated clearly, loud enough for every single person in the room to hear, that William's exclusive black card had just been completely declined for the $50,000 catering and venue tab. The heavy silence that followed was absolute perfection. I watched the arrogant smirk melt off my father's face as the crushing reality of his sudden financial ruin finally began to sink in right now. The catering manager stood frozen, holding the declined black card, the plastic trembling in his sweating hand. Catherine snatched the card from his fingers, her diamond rings flashing under the recessed lighting. She shoved the manager aside and pulled her gold-case smartphone from her designer purse. Her chest heaved as she pointed a manicured finger at my face, her pristine facade completely unraveling. She shrieked that I was committing outright financial terrorism. She declared she was calling the Chicago Police Department to have me arrested for cybercrimes, extortion, and trespassing. She punched the screen of her phone with frantic, shaking fingers, demanding that the authorities come drag me out of the building in handcuffs. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us until I could smell the expensive lavender perfume she had worn since I was a child. I did not retreat. I leaned in close, my voice dropping to a deadly, resonant calm that commanded the attention of every single person in the VIP lounge. I told her to call them. I told her to press the buttons and invite the police right up to this luxury suite. I challenged her to look those officers in the eye and explain exactly why she was so terrified of her own flesh and blood. I demanded she tell them the true story of what happened 15 years ago. Call them Catherine. I challenged, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the room. Tell the police exactly how you smiled when the house was collapsing around us. Tell them how you looked back through the suffocating black smoke and saw me trapped under the burning wooden doorframe. Tell them how you watched Dad grab Courtney by the wrist and yank her toward the only safe stairwell. Catherine stopped dialing. Her phone slipped slightly in her grip. William let out a strangled gasp, his face turning an ashen, sickly gray. I took another step forward, backing my mother against the leather seating area. I raised my voice so the words echoed off the mahogany-paneled walls. I told her to confess how she looked right into my terrified teenage eyes as the flames licked the wallpaper. I told her to repeat the exact words she said before slamming the fire door shut. I quoted her verbatim, my voice completely steady. "We cannot risk losing our little girl. That was what you said to him as you left your eldest daughter to burn alive in a house you intentionally set on fire." Courtney let out a high-pitched wail, covering her ears, as if trying to block out a physical blow. She buried her face in Donovan's chest, sobbing hysterically, begging him to make me stop telling these horrible, disgusting lies. She cried that I was a monster, a sick individual who had come to ruin their perfect family with insane delusions. I turned away from my trembling mother and walked over to the sleek media console mounted on the wall. The VIP room was equipped with a massive 80-inch projector screen, currently displaying a paused campaign video of Donovan smiling with his arm around Courtney. I pulled a small, encrypted flash drive from my emerald clutch. I plugged it directly into the presentation port. The campaign video vanished, replaced instantly by a stark, high-resolution digital bank dossier. The bright white glare of the financial documents illuminated the dark room, casting harsh shadows across William and Catherine's horrified faces. The document on the screen was a certified bank ledger from 15 years ago, bearing the official seal of a major national insurance conglomerate. I grabbed the presentation remote from the console and pressed the laser pointer button. A bright green dot appeared on the screen, circling a specific line item. I read the text aloud for the room, making sure every syllable landed like a judge's gavel. The document showed a massive lump sum payout, $3 million. The green laser danced over the recipient line, highlighting William's legal name and his primary offshore account number. Then I moved the laser pointer to the memo section of the wire transfer. The text was undeniable, printed in bold black ink. It read, "Life insurance claim payout. Beneficiary of Lauren Catherine Davies, deceased." The silence in the room became absolute. It was a suffocating, terrifying quiet. I turned back to my parents, who were now clinging to each other like cornered animals. I told them they did not just leave me in that burning hallway because they favored Courtney. They left me there because they needed a corpse to cash out my life insurance policy. They declared me legally dead. They held a closed casket memorial service with an empty box, accepted the condolences of their wealthy friends, and pocketed $3 million in blood money to save themselves from bankruptcy. Donovan stood perfectly still, his dark eyes locked on the glowing projector screen. As a former federal prosecutor, his mind processed evidence with clinical, terrifying speed. He saw the exact date of the $3 million transfer. He read the fraudulent death certificate number listed in the margins of the banking dossier. He saw the undeniable proof of his father-in-law's guilt. The legal implications flashed through his mind in an instant. This was not a simple family dispute over a mismanaged trust fund or a bad real estate investment. This was textbook wire fraud. This was a calculated multi-million-dollar insurance scam. And above all else, this was the premeditated attempted murder of a minor. Donovan looked down at Courtney. His sobbing wife was tightly clutching his expensive designer suit jacket, her face buried against his chest, her silence acting as a confession of her own complicity. The man who had built his entire political platform on truth and justice stared at the criminals he had married into. Donovan slowly, deliberately stepped backward, completely peeling his wife's frantic, shaking hands off his body, utterly disgusted by her actions. The VIP room went completely dead silent, the kind of silence that rings in your ears and makes the air feel too heavy to breathe. Even the faint bass line of the music from the main ballroom seemed to vanish, swallowed by the magnitude of the crimes projected on the screen. Courtney was the first to break the stillness. She scrambled to bridge the physical gap Donovan had just created between them. Her hands reached out, her perfectly manicured fingers grasping at empty air as she desperately tried to weave a new reality. She looked up at her husband with wide, frantic eyes, her voice trembling with a nauseating mix of manufactured panic and venom. She claimed I was a psychopath. She shrieked that I had intentionally faked my own death just to torture them, vanishing into the night like a ghost, while they wept over an empty casket. Courtney frantically insisted that her parents were completely innocent, grieving victims who had only accepted the insurance payout because they were entirely consumed by sorrow and did not know how else to cope with the tragic loss of their eldest daughter. It was a pathetic, transparent performance, and everyone in the room knew it. Donovan did not even blink. He did not look down at his sobbing wife. His sharp, calculating gaze remained locked dead on my father. The former federal prosecutor had fully taken over. The loving, supportive son-in-law was gone, replaced instantly by an interrogator who smelled blood in the water. Donovan stepped around Courtney as if she were a piece of discarded furniture. He closed the distance between himself and William, his towering frame casting a long, dark shadow over the older man. Donovan demanded the truth. His voice was not loud, but it carried a lethal, chilling authority that demanded absolute compliance. He asked William exactly where the initial seed money for the senatorial campaign had come from. He wanted to know the exact origin of the pristine, untraceable funds that had catapulted him into the political spotlight. William began to stammer. Sweat poured down his flushed forehead, soaking the expensive collar of his tuxedo shirt. He held up his hands in a defensive gesture, his eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for an escape route that did not exist. William tried to talk his way out of the corner, his voice cracking as he babbled about smart investments, offshore real estate dividends, and generational wealth. He claimed the money was completely clean, legally acquired through decades of hard work and savvy business decisions. He swore on his life that he had never jeopardized Donovan's pristine political career, desperately trying to reassure the rising star that the campaign was built on a solid legal foundation. It was the desperate, flailing lie of a man who knew he was staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. I did not let him finish his pathetic explanation. I calmly walked across the plush carpet and positioned myself directly between Donovan and my father. I reached into my clutch one final time and pulled out a thick stack of folded paper. They were not digital copies or easily manipulated screenshots. They were certified, stamped, and authenticated bank wire transfer receipts from the Grand Caymans. I held the stack out to Donovan. I told him he did not have to take my word for it. I told him the paper trail told the entire story, mapping every single penny from the moment it left the insurance conglomerate to the exact second it landed in his campaign war chest. Donovan took the papers from my hand. I watched his eyes scan the bold black ink. He tracked the routing numbers, matching them mentally with the financial disclosures he had personally signed off on when launching his Senate run. I watched the horrible realization dawn on his face. The supposedly clean money William had proudly invested into his son-in-law's political future was the exact same blood money paid out from my fraudulent death policy. William had taken the profits from his attempted murder and used them to buy a United States senator. Every single campaign ad, every gala, every handshake, and every flyer had been funded by a violent, horrific crime. Donovan realized in a terrifying instant that his hands were now covered in the same filth as my parents'. His entire platform of unwavering justice and integrity had been built on a foundation of arson, fraud, and attempted homicide. Before Donovan could formulate a response, a loud clatter shattered the tense atmosphere. Everyone turned toward the darkest corner of the VIP suite. Standing near the heavy velvet exit curtains was Arthur Donovan's seasoned campaign manager. Arthur was a veteran political operative who had spent 3 decades navigating Washington scandals, but he had never seen anything like this. His face had gone completely pale, entirely drained of blood. He was staring at the projector screen with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. The heavy plastic clipboard he carried everywhere had slipped from his trembling hands, crashing loudly onto the marble floor below. Arthur knew the law just as well as Donovan did. He instantly recognized the severe federal implications of knowingly spending fraudulently obtained funds on a federal election campaign. He knew the FBI would descend on their headquarters before sunrise, freezing every account, seizing every hard drive, and handing out subpoenas like candy. Arthur took a rapid step backward, distancing himself from the toxic fallout. He looked directly at Donovan, his voice shaking but resolute. Arthur announced loudly that he was officially resigning from the campaign, effective immediately. He stated that he had absolutely no knowledge of these financial irregularities and refused to spend the rest of his life rotting in a federal penitentiary for a crime he did not commit. Without waiting for a response, Arthur spun on his heel, shoved past the velvet curtains, and sprinted down the hallway, fleeing to avoid the impending federal investigation. The curtains swung shut behind Arthur, sealing the VIP lounge in a vacuum of panic. Donovan did not chase after his campaign manager. He simply took another step away from Courtney, his eyes locked on William with the cold, assessing glare of a prosecutor evaluating a prime suspect. The silence stretched until it became a physical weight pressing down on the room. William had spent his entire life bullying, bribing, and bluffing his way out of every conceivable consequence. But Arthur fleeing was the ultimate confirmation that the walls were finally closing in. The realization snapped whatever fragile thread of self-control my father had left. William let out a roar devoid of his usual polished sophistication. His face contorted into a mask of unfiltered rage. He lunged across the carpet directly at me, his hands outstretched like claws, fully intending to wrap his thick fingers around my throat. He was a desperate animal backed into a corner, relying on the only tactic left. When money and influence failed him, physical intimidation. I did not flinch. I did not even take a step back. I simply held my ground and watched the inevitable unfold. Before William could cross the final 3 feet between us, a shadow detached itself from the dim corner of the room. Marcus, the head of my private security detail, moved with terrifying, silent speed. He had been standing by the entrance the entire time, blending perfectly into the background in his tailored suit. Marcus intercepted my father. He grabbed William by the lapels of his tuxedo, spun him around with effortless brute force, and slammed him face first onto the polished mahogany surface of the private bar. In one fluid motion, Marcus pinned William's right arm painfully behind his back, securing him completely. William gasped, his cheek pressed flat against the cold wood, his champagne spilling and pooling around his face. Catherine erupted into a hysterical shriek. The composed matriarch vanished, replaced by a frantic, screaming woman. She threw her hands in the air, her diamond bracelets clinking violently as she pointed a shaking finger at me. She demanded that Marcus release her husband immediately. She screamed that I was an absolute lunatic, a violent thug who had hired muscle to assault an innocent businessman. Her voice reached a fever pitch as she threatened to call the police, the press, and the best defense attorneys in Chicago. She shrieked that she would sue me for every single penny I possessed, that she would tie me up in litigation for decades, and that she would personally ensure I spent the rest of my life rotting in a jail cell. Catherine promised to take my company, my bank accounts, and everything I owned as compensation for this horrific attack. I calmly looked down at my emerald gown, brushing a piece of lint from the silk fabric. I met her manic, tear-filled eyes with absolute serenity. I let a slow, chilling smile spread across my face as I addressed her threats. "Sue me," I asked, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal edge that instantly silenced her screaming. I told Catherine she was living in a fantasy world if she thought she had the resources to hire a parking ticket lawyer, let alone a corporate litigation firm. I took a slow step toward her, watching the confusion momentarily replace the anger on her powdered face. I informed my mother that she could not sue me to take everything I owned because she did not even own the very roof over her head. Catherine blinked, stumbling back a half step. She looked at William, who was still pinned against the bar, groaning in pain. She stammered out a denial, insisting that their suburban estate was paid off years ago, that their home was a fortress of equity and wealth. I reached back into my clutch and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I broke the wax seal with my thumb and pulled out a stack of legal documents printed on heavy cardstock. I held the paperwork up under the dim lights of the chandelier. I explained to Catherine that her husband had quietly taken out a massive high-interest second mortgage on their family estate 5 years ago. I told her that the bank had grown extremely tired of his constant excuses and missed payments. I smiled very warmly and informed her that my venture capital firm had purchased the family's toxic debt portfolio directly from the bank 3 months ago for pennies on the dollar. I owned their mortgage. I owned their home. Courtney gasped, stepping forward to look at the paperwork. Catherine shook her head wildly, demanding to know where the money went, screaming at William to tell her this was a lie. I answered for him. I told Catherine to look at her youngest daughter. I explained that William had been secretly siphoning those massive mortgage payments for years, just to fund Courtney's lavish picture-perfect lifestyle. Every designer handbag, every luxury vacation, every exorbitant down payment for Courtney's real estate, and every catered event for Donovan's campaign had been funded by draining the equity from the family estate. William had mortgaged their home to buy Courtney's happiness and secure Donovan's political rise. I told Catherine that the account was now 60 days delinquent. They were entirely out of time, out of money, and out of options. I signaled to a terrified catering waiter standing frozen near the door. I placed the stack of legal documents onto his silver serving platter. I directed him to walk over to my mother. The waiter trembled as he carried the silver platter across the room, stopping directly in front of Catherine. Resting perfectly in the center of the silver tray was a formal expedited notice of foreclosure and immediate eviction. I told my mother she had exactly 48 hours to pack her bags and vacate my property before the sheriff arrived to physically drag her out onto the lawn. The silver serving platter clattered violently against the marble floor as Catherine dropped it in shock. The sharp, sudden metallic sound snapped Courtney out of her paralyzed state. The pristine, supportive political wife facade shattered entirely, replaced instantly by a feral, unhinged fury. She let out a guttural scream, spun around, and grabbed the massive baccarat crystal centerpiece resting on the mahogany bar. With a vicious heave, Courtney hurled the heavy crystal across the room. It smashed against the paneled wall, showering the VIP lounge in 1,000 glittering, jagged shards. Guests in the main ballroom could likely hear the destruction, but nobody dared enter the suite. Courtney breathed heavily, her chest heaving violently, her designer gown torn at the shoulder from her frantic movements. She pointed a shaking manicured finger at my chest, her face twisted into a grotesque mask of pure hatred. She shrieked that I was a jealous, miserable, ungrateful parasite who deserved nothing. She screamed loudly that I absolutely deserved to be left behind in that burning hallway 15 years ago, coughing on the black smoke. Her voice cracked as she yelled that I was an awkward, pathetic, ungrateful teenager who brought absolutely zero value to the prestigious Davies family name. According to Courtney, I was a social liability, a dark cloud who ruined their perfect aesthetic and aggressively dragged their high society reputation through the mud. She justified my attempted murder as a simple house-cleaning measure, shrieking that they were right to leave me in the smoke because I was completely and utterly worthless. I stood perfectly and utterly still amidst the falling, glittering crystal dust. I did not raise my voice to match her hysterical shrieking. Instead, I let a cold, quiet, predatory smile touch my lips. I smoothly straightened the fabric of my emerald dress, brushing away an invisible speck of dirt with absolute composure. I looked directly into Courtney's wild, panic-stricken eyes and asked her if she really wanted to discuss who brought value to the family. I asked her if she wanted to explain to her husband exactly why she was the golden child, and I was the expendable scapegoat. Brought no value, I repeated, my tone dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper that commanded the entire room. I took the heavy blame for the tragic fire, Courtney. I took the terrible fall for your spectacular, catastrophic negligence, so you could keep your pristine, perfect reputation intact. I took a deliberate, measured step toward her, forcing her to carefully back away until her bare spine hit the dark paneled wall. I ordered her to tell Donovan the real story. Tell your horrified husband exactly how the fire actually started. I commanded, my voice echoing off the remaining crystal fixtures. Tell him about your illegal basement party while Mom and Dad were out of town. Tell him about the excessive drinking the underage guests and the cheap knocked-over space heater you shoved next to the drywall curtains. Tell him how you panicked, grabbed your friends, and ran up the stairs, locking the basement door behind you to hide the evidence while the flames spread upward into the main house. Courtney firmly clamped her hands over her ears, violently shaking her head back and forth as if trying to physically dislodge the memory. She squeezed her eyes shut tightly and screamed that I was lying, begging Donovan not to listen to a single solitary word. William, still pinned firmly against the bar by Marcus, groaned loudly and ordered me to shut my mouth. Catherine was sobbing hysterically on the floor, helplessly clutching the foreclosure notice like a lifeline in a turbulent storm. I ignored them all. I reached deeply into the hidden pocket of my velvet clutch and withdrew a carefully folded yellowing document enclosed in a thick, protective plastic sleeve. I held it up for Donovan to see. The paper bore the faded official seal of the Chicago Fire Department. I explained that this was the original unredacted fire marshal report from the night our family estate burned to the ground. It was the exact document that detailed the point of origin in the basement, clearly listing the knocked-over space heater and the undeniable damning presence of empty liquor bottles carelessly scattered around the ignition site. I pointed out the bold red date and the signature of the lead investigator. Then I pulled out a corresponding bank statement. I informed Donovan that this second piece of paper showed a massive, untraceable wire transfer from William's offshore account directly to that specific corrupt fire marshal a mere 48 short hours after the fire was extinguished. William had bribed a federal official to bury the original report, falsify the investigation, and blame the electrical wiring in my upstairs bedroom. They framed me for the fire to protect Courtney from criminal negligence charges, and then they left me to burn alive in the very inferno she created. Donovan reached out with a trembling hand and took the plastic sleeve from my grip. He stared intensely at the yellowing fire marshal report, his dark eyes scanning the specific horrific details I had just outlined. He looked at the bank statement verifying the date and the recipient of the bribe. The undeniably concrete proof of the malicious conspiracy was right there in bold black ink. He slowly lowered the papers, his jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle ticked visibly in his cheek. He turned his head slowly and looked at his sobbing, frantic wife. The woman he had loved, trusted, and built a massive life with was entirely unrecognizable to him now. His voice was completely hollow, utterly drained of any affection or human warmth. "You burned down your own beautiful house?" Donovan asked the terrible question hanging in the suffocating silence of the room. "You nearly killed your own innocent sister, and you let your corrupt parents frame it as a tragic accident just to save your own worthless skin." Donovan stared down at his wife as she cowered against the panels. The man who had spent the last 5 years championing truth, transparency, and justice looked at Courtney with absolute unfiltered revulsion. He did not yell. He did not scream. He simply stepped away from her as if she were a carrier of a deadly plague. The physical distance he placed between them was a final, undeniable severing of their marriage vows. Donovan turned his back on his sobbing wife and locked his furious gaze on William. The patriarch of the Davies family was still struggling against Marcus, his face purple with rage and exertion, but Donovan's cold stare froze him in place. Donovan slowly walked toward his father-in-law, his imposing stature casting a heavy shadow over the older man. He asked William how he could possibly live with himself. He demanded to know how a father could look at his own flesh and blood, knowing she had been burned, framed, and discarded, all to protect a spoiled, reckless teenager and a dwindling bank account. Donovan stated that he had spent his entire career prosecuting men exactly like William, men who believed their wealth shielded them from the consequences of their heinous actions. He promised William that he would personally ensure the FBI dismantled the estate brick by brick, exposing every fraudulent wire transfer, bribed official, and buried secret. Donovan vowed to strip them of their name, their freedom, and remaining dignity. William stopped struggling against the security guard. A desperate, frantic gleam replaced the anger in his eyes. He realized intimidation had failed, so he instantly pivoted to the only currency he had left to offer. He tried to buy his way out of hell. William lowered his voice to a conspiratorial, urgent whisper, attempting to forge a dark alliance with the furious politician. He told Donovan to stop thinking like a self-righteous prosecutor and start thinking like a United States senator. William insisted that destroying the Davies family would drag Donovan down with them, completely annihilating his pristine public image. He begged his son-in-law to see the bigger picture. William promised Donovan that if he helped silence Lauren, if he helped bury this evidence tonight, the rewards would be unimaginable. He swore he could guarantee Donovan a direct, unimpeded path to the governor's mansion within 4 years. William babbled about his elite connections, promising unrestricted access to the most powerful, deep-pocketed political action committees in the Midwest. He offered limitless financial backing, guaranteeing that Donovan would never have to worry about campaign funding for the rest of his political career. "Just help me crush her," William pleaded, his voice dripping with venom as he nodded toward me. He told Donovan that I was just a bitter, unstable outcast, trying to ruin a beautiful political dynasty, and that together they could easily lock me away in a psychiatric facility and throw away the key. I watched the two men bargain over my freedom and my sanity as if I were not even standing in the room. I watched Donovan briefly pause, his jaw tight, his eyes darting toward the floor as he absorbed the magnitude of William's corrupt offer. Before the politician could utter a single word in response, I let out a sharp, resonant laugh that cut through the heavy, suffocating air of the VIP lounge. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, drawing the attention of every single person in the room. I told William his offer was incredibly generous, but unfortunately, he was making promises with a checkbook he no longer owned to a man whose career was already entirely dead. I reached up and tapped my index finger against the small diamond lapel pin fastened to the collar of my emerald silk dress. I asked Donovan if he recognized the design. I told him it was not just a piece of high-end jewelry. I pointed directly to the tiny, microscopic red light blinking rhythmically in the center of the largest diamond. The red light pulsed with a steady, undeniable heartbeat. I informed them that my lapel pin was a high-definition encrypted recording device. I smiled warmly and told Donovan that I had not just been recording the events of the evening for my own personal archives. I had been live-streaming the entire unedited confrontation. I explained that the secure encrypted link to this live broadcast had been emailed directly to the personal inboxes of his top 30 campaign donors exactly 5 minutes before I walked into the suite. I told the aspiring senator that every single pharmaceutical executive, real estate mogul, and tech billionaire funding his political run had just watched his wife confess to arson and attempted murder. They had watched his father-in-law admit to federal wire fraud, bribery, and witness tampering. And most importantly, they had just watched the great, incorruptible Donovan listen to a massive illegal bribery attempt without immediately placing the man under citizen's arrest. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with the terrifying weight of total destruction. Then the inevitable happened. A sharp, loud buzzing sound erupted from Donovan's tuxedo jacket pocket. It was immediately followed by a second buzz and then a third. Within seconds, his phone was vibrating frantically, a continuous, unrelenting mechanical hum that echoed against the mahogany walls. Donovan pulled the device from his pocket with a shaking hand. The screen was a waterfall of notifications, missed calls, and incoming text messages. His major financial backers, the wealthy men and women who built his campaign from the ground up, were violently pulling their support in real time. The texts were brutal and definitive, withdrawing endorsements, demanding immediate refunds of their contributions, and severing all ties with his toxic administration. Donovan stared blindly at the glowing screen, his face completely devoid of color, as he realized his entire marriage, his family, and his once brilliant political future had just burned to the ground. Donovan stared blankly at his vibrating phone, watching his political future evaporate. The donors were abandoning ship. The realization hit Catherine with the force of a physical blow. She scrambled upward, her tear-streaked face twisting with desperate realization. If the elite backers walked out the front doors, the Davies family was entirely finished. The foreclosure, the federal charges, the social ruin would become inescapable realities. Catherine refused to lose without a fight. She smoothed her ruined hair, her survival instincts overriding her panic. She shot me a look of pure venom before turning on her heel and sprinting toward the heavy velvet curtains. She shoved past them, bursting out of the VIP suite and sprinting straight toward the main ballroom. She was a woman possessed, determined to spin a public narrative and salvage the situation before the elite reached the valet stand. I followed her at a measured pace, stepping through the curtains just in time to watch her ascend the grand staircase to the main stage. The gala was in a state of confused disarray. The string quartet had stopped playing. Wealthy donors in tuxedos and gowns were checking their phones, whispering frantically, and edging toward the exits. Catherine practically threw herself at the podium. She grabbed the microphone with trembling hands. A sharp screech of feedback echoed through the cavernous room, instantly freezing the crowd in place. Catherine weaponized her tears with the practiced precision of a seasoned actress. She let out a heart-wrenching sob that amplified over the massive speakers. She begged her friends and esteemed colleagues to please stay and listen. Catherine clutched the podium and delivered the performance of a lifetime. She cried that her long-lost, deeply traumatized daughter had miraculously returned from the dead. The crowd gasped in collective shock. Catherine did not stop to let them process the revelation. She immediately twisted the knife, weeping openly as she claimed that I was suffering from a severe, violent psychotic break. She wailed that the trauma of the past 15 years had shattered my mind. Catherine begged the crowd for their sympathy, their prayers, and their continued financial support. She shrieked that I was holding her family hostage in a back room with paranoid delusions, and that the vicious lies spreading through their network were the ravings of a disturbed individual who desperately needed psychiatric help. She pleaded with the room not to let a mental health crisis destroy the beautiful campaign Donovan had built. Catherine played the heartbroken, desperate mother to absolute perfection. A murmur of sympathetic confusion began to ripple through the sea of designer gowns and expensive suits. People were hesitating. The mass exodus slowed as the elite crowd absorbed this dramatic new narrative. Catherine was buying them time. I stood in the shadows near the sound engineer's booth at the back of the ballroom, watching her masterclass in manipulation. I did not step out to argue with her. I did not scream that she was lying. I simply pulled my smartphone from my emerald clutch. As the owner of the venture capital firm possessing the luxury hotel's massive debt portfolio, I had demanded absolute administrative access to the building's central operating systems prior to my arrival. I opened the encrypted application on my screen. With 3 quick taps, I bypassed the physical soundboard located next to me. I locked the ballroom's primary audio system, instantly severing the connection to Catherine's podium microphone. Her frantic sobbing pleas were abruptly cut off, leaving her mouthing silent words to the confused audience. I selected a specific audio file from my encrypted drive and routed it directly into the hotel's surround sound system. I slowly maximized the volume and played it. A sharp digital click echoed across the massive ballroom, followed instantly by the harsh, unmistakable, and entirely familiar voice of Catherine Davies. It was not a voice filled with sorrow, grief, or maternal panic. It was a recording of a voicemail Catherine had left exactly 15 years ago, just 2 days after they held an empty casket memorial service for their eldest daughter. Her voice boomed through the speakers, devoid of any warmth, dripping with aggressive, impatient entitlement. "Yes, this is Catherine Davies." The recorded voice snapped the audio, crisp and undeniable, echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "I am leaving yet another message for the senior claims adjuster. This delay is completely unacceptable. We submitted the death certificate for Lauren on Tuesday. I need to know exactly when the $3 million life insurance check is going to clear. We have a country club membership to renew by the end of the week, and I am not going to miss the summer gala because your office is dragging its feet over a routine casualty payout. Call my husband back immediately and expedite those funds. The voicemail ended with a sharp, resonant click. The silence that slammed into the gala ballroom was absolute and deafening. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet that completely paralyzed the hundreds of Chicago elites standing in the room. The transition from Catherine's live weeping performance to the cold, undeniable audio evidence of her sociopathic greed was whiplash-inducing. The horror dawned on the crowd simultaneously. The sympathetic confusion vanished, replaced by sheer, unadulterated revulsion. The donors realized they were not looking at a heartbroken mother struggling with a psychotic child. They were looking at a monster who had eagerly traded her daughter's life for a country club membership. The silence held for 3 agonizing seconds before the horrified murmurs began swelling rapidly into a tidal wave of whispers. On the grand stage, Catherine stood completely frozen. Her meticulously applied makeup could not hide the blood rapidly draining from her face. Her jaw dropped. Her eyes were wide with a terror she had never experienced in her pampered life. The microphone slipped from her trembling, manicured fingers. It plummeted toward the stage floor, hitting the polished hardwood with a loud thud that echoed through the room like a final gavel strike. I left the horrified gasps of the main ballroom behind me. The heavy, muffled thud of Catherine dropping the microphone on the grand ballroom stage echoed faintly through the thick mahogany doors of the VIP suite. The sudden, horrifying silence that followed from the hundreds of elite guests outside confirmed that her pathetic, manipulative smear campaign had spectacularly imploded. Inside the private lounge, the atmosphere was suffocating thick with the stench of a shattered dynasty. Donovan did not even glance toward the doors to check on his disgraced mother-in-law. His entire focus was locked onto Courtney. The polished political facade was completely gone. He stepped toward his wife, his dark eyes boring into her with the intensity of a prosecutor who had cornered a murderer on the witness stand. He demanded the absolute ultimate truth. Donovan leaned in close, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded the room. He asked Courtney if she knew. He demanded to know if she was fully aware that her own sister was alive all these years, while she greedily collected and spent the $3 million life insurance payout. Courtney shrank back against the dark wood paneling, her breathing erratic and shallow. She looked like a trapped animal. The diamond necklace around her throat trembled as she shook her head back and forth in frantic, violent denial. She reached out desperately, grabbing the lapels of Donovan's tuxedo jacket. She swore to him that she had absolutely no idea. She shrieked that the authorities had found remains in the fire, and she genuinely believed those remains belonged to her sister. Tears streamed down her meticulously contoured face, ruining her makeup as she begged her husband to believe her. Courtney sobbed that the grief had nearly destroyed her mind. She looked up at Donovan with wide, pleading eyes and swore on her life, on their sacred marriage vows, and on the future children they were planning to have. She loudly swore that she thought I had burned to ash in that hallway 15 years ago. I stood perfectly still, watching her weave yet another grotesque, manipulative web of lies. I did not raise my voice. I smoothly opened my emerald silk clutch and reached into the hidden interior pocket. I withdrew a single, neatly folded sheet of standard white printer paper. I told Courtney that swearing on her hypothetical children was a genuinely vile tactic, even for someone as morally bankrupt as her. I unfolded the paper and held it up for Donovan to read. I explained that exactly 10 years ago, when I was struggling to survive on minimum wage and eating discarded food from a diner dumpster, I had experienced a brief, foolish moment of weakness. I had reached out to the sister I thought might be carrying the heavy burden of my tragic death. I created a secure, untraceable burner account and sent a simple email directly to Courtney's private inbox. I told her I was alive, that I was safe, and that I forgave her for the accident. Donovan took the paper from my hand, his eyes scanning the printed text. I pointed to the bottom of the page. I instructed him to look closely at the system-generated red receipt. The bold text clearly proved the email had been opened, read, and manually deleted exactly 4 minutes after it arrived in Courtney's inbox. She knew I was alive a decade ago. I looked directly at my sister, whose face had gone completely white. I told Donovan that Courtney deleted the message and hid the truth because revealing my survival would have triggered a massive federal fraud investigation. She chose to keep the $3 million insurance payout to fund her luxurious lifestyle rather than bring her sister home. Donovan slowly lowered the paper. He looked at Courtney with a level of pure, unfiltered revulsion that made her physically recoil. He did not yell. He did not argue. He simply reached over and gripped his left ring finger. With agonizing, deliberate precision, Donovan pulled his gold wedding band over his knuckle. He placed the heavy ring flat on the polished mahogany table, severing their marriage with a sharp metallic clink. William, still pinned against the bar by Marcus, watched his daughter's marriage disintegrate. Panic and fury warred on his sweating purple face. Desperate to regain control of his crumbling empire, William violently shoved his shoulder forward and tried to pull rank. He spat venom in my direction, his chest heaving as he laughed a harsh, grating laugh. He pointed a shaking finger at the foreclosure notice I had dropped earlier. William boasted loudly that I was a foolish, naive little girl playing a rich man's game. He smugly declared that evicting the Davies family via standard foreclosure would take years tied up in housing courts. He sneered that he retained the most expensive, ruthless real estate lawyers in the state of Illinois. William promised to completely bleed my venture capital firm dry in legal fees, boasting that his social status made him utterly untouchable. I let a cold, predatory smile touch my lips. I smoothly stepped closer to the sweating patriarch and corrected his fundamental misunderstanding. I told William this was not a standard bank foreclosure. I explained that his offshore accounts and deliberate tax evasion had triggered an immediate, aggressive federal response. The Internal Revenue Service had officially seized the entire Davies estate last month. I informed him that I did not buy his debt from a bank. I purchased the sprawling, luxurious estate directly from the federal government at a closed tax auction last Tuesday morning. I leaned in, dropping my voice to an icy whisper. I told William that I was the sole, undisputed legal owner of the property, and his family were currently nothing more than criminal squatters trespassing in my home. Catherine stumbled inside. I signaled my guards. They handed William and Catherine heavy-duty black trash bags. I stared at them, my voice absolute. "You have exactly 24 hours to vacate my property." Catherine stared at the heavy black plastic trash bags dangling from the security guard's thick fingers. The visceral reality of her eviction finally pierced her delusion. The sprawling mansion, the manicured gardens, the vaulted ceilings, all of it was gone, legally stripped away by the daughter she had discarded. Something fundamentally broke inside Catherine's mind. The aristocratic poise she had weaponized for decades completely evaporated, leaving behind a feral, cornered creature. With a sudden guttural shriek that scraped against the paneled walls, Catherine lunged forward. She did not aim for my throat or my face. Her wild, frantic eyes were locked entirely on the emerald silk clutch in my hand and the smartphone resting in my palm. She understood that those devices held the digital keys to her total destruction. Her manicured nails, usually reserved for delicate teacups and charity gala check signing, curled into violent claws as she threw her entire body weight at my chest. The impact forced me back a half step, but I planted my heels firmly into the plush carpet. Catherine clawed desperately at my hands, her diamond rings scratching against my knuckles. She gasped and hissed, blindly swiping at the encrypted phone, desperate to smash the glass, corrupt the drive, or physically annihilate the mountain of evidence I had spent years meticulously compiling. It was a pathetic, chaotic scuffle that lasted exactly 4 seconds. Marcus stepped forward with terrifying speed, his massive arms wrapping around Catherine's waist. He hauled her backward effortlessly, lifting her expensive heels completely off the ground. Catherine thrashed against the security guard's impenetrable grip. She kicked her legs, her designer gown bunching around her knees, abandoning every ounce of high society decorum. When she realized she could not physically break free, she weaponized her voice. She screamed with a raw, blistering fury that rattled the crystal fixtures. She shrieked that I was an ungrateful, wretched parasite who owed her everything. Catherine yelled that she had sacrificed her body to give birth to me, that she had fed me, clothed me, and allowed me to exist under her prestigious roof. She demanded that I give them their life back immediately. According to Catherine, my survival was a curse, an incredibly selfish act that had single-handedly ruined her golden years. She sobbed, demanding that I fix the financial ruin I had caused, shrieking that children owed their parents unconditional loyalty, even in death. William watched his wife unravel, his face still shining with cold sweat, entirely paralyzed by the consequences closing in around them. Donovan stood perfectly rigid by the mahogany bar, his face a mask of absolute disgust as he witnessed the true, monstrous nature of the woman he had called a mother-in-law. I stood my ground, smoothing out the rumpled fabric of my dress. I did not raise my voice to match her hysterical screaming. I let a cold, dead smile stretch across my face. I looked directly into Catherine's manic, bloodshot eyes and asked her if she truly wanted to discuss the concept of debts and repayments. I opened my clutch, unfazed by her previous attempt to destroy it. I reached past the phone and the velvet lining, withdrawing a thick stack of official financial documents. I held the papers up, letting the bright lounge lighting illuminate the dense columns of numbers and red warning flags. I told Catherine that these were not bank statements or simple foreclosure notices. I explained that I had pulled comprehensive, deeply detailed credit reports from all three major national bureaus. I took a slow, measured step toward her, my voice dropping to a dangerous, precise whisper that commanded the silence of the room. I asked her if she remembered the exact day the insurance company issued the $3 million casualty check for my supposed tragic death. I watched her swallow hard, her eyes darting away from the papers in my hand. I told the room that Catherine did not just accept the blood money and move on with her luxurious life. She had decided to maximize her profits. I held up the first page of the credit report and read the name printed at the top. It was my name. I informed Donovan and William that Catherine had been actively, maliciously using my social security number for the past 15 years. She had stolen the identity of her own dead teenage daughter. I flipped to the second page, pointing to the endless list of high-limit platinum cards, luxury department store accounts, and massive personal loans. I explained that whenever Catherine maxed out William's accounts, whenever the Davies family faced a slight dip in their cash flow, she simply opened a new secret line of credit in my name. She had funded 15 years of European vacations, designer shopping sprees, and high-end cosmetic surgeries using the identity of a ghost. I told her that she had ruined my credit before I was even old enough to legally drive a car. I asked Catherine how it felt to wear the digital skin of the daughter she left to burn. Catherine stopped struggling against Marcus. The exposure of her federal identity theft severed her vocal cords. She stared at the credit reports, realizing her 15-year shopping spree was documented and inescapable. William groaned, sliding down the bar, realizing his wife had just guaranteed them both federal prison sentences. Donovan simply shook his head, retreating toward the exit to escape the stench of their generational corruption. I told Catherine I did not owe her a single cent or a single moment of sympathy. Before she could muster another lie, a deafening crash echoed from the corridor. The heavy double doors of the VIP suite were violently shoved open, slamming hard against the walls. It was not hotel security. A dozen men and women in tactical gear poured into the room, their badges gleaming under the lights. It was a heavily armed raid team from the FBI Economic Crimes Division. The sudden explosive entrance of the federal agents shattered the remaining fragments of the Davies family's false reality. A dozen heavily armed men and women from the FBI Economic Crimes Division flooded the VIP suite, their tactical boots thudding against the plush carpet. They moved with terrifying coordinated precision. Flashlights cut through the dim ambient lighting of the lounge, and sharp authoritative voices commanded everyone to freeze. The sheer magnitude of the raid instantly paralyzed the room. Donovan backed away slowly, raising his hands to show his compliance, eager to physically and legally distance himself from the toxic wreckage of his marriage. Courtney remained frozen against the wood paneling, staring in wide-eyed horror at the federal windbreakers. Marcus released his iron grip on Catherine, smoothly stepping aside to allow the authorities to take control. But William did not freeze. The moment the federal agents breached the mahogany doors, the arrogant, untouchable patriarch finally understood that his empire was dead. His offshore accounts, his expensive lawyers, and his elite political connections could not save him from a direct federal indictment. Raw, cowardly survival instinct hijacked his brain. He did not look at his weeping daughter. He did not glance at his frantic, hyperventilating wife. William abandoned his family without a single second of hesitation. He spun on his heel and bolted. He made a desperate, pathetic dash toward the back of the suite, sprinting for the concealed swinging doors that led to the hotel's private catering kitchen. Beyond that culinary space was a restricted service elevator, his only potential escape route to the basement loading dock. William hit the swinging doors with his shoulder bursting into the sterile, brightly lit area. He did not make it to the elevator. 3 tactical agents had anticipated the flight risk. They flanked the kitchen entrance, moving faster than the aging, panicked executive could ever hope to run. Before William could even reach out to press the elevator call button, a federal agent tackled him from the blind side. The sheer kinetic impact violently lifted William completely off his expensive leather loafers. The agent drove William forward aggressively, slamming him face first into a massive stainless steel prep table. The violent crash echoed loudly over the mechanical hum of the industrial refrigerators. Metal catering pans clattered to the floor as William's chest hit the freezing steel. Another agent immediately seized William's arms, twisting them painfully behind his back. William gasped for air, his cheek pressed flat against the sterile metal surface. He weakly protested, wheezing that he was a respected businessman and aggressively demanding his attorney. The agents ignored his sputtering, arrogant demands. The sharp, unmistakable sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting shut around his wrists echoed through the quiet kitchen. The previously untouchable patriarch of the Davies dynasty was instantly reduced to a common, physically restrained fugitive. The agents hauled William upright, his expensive tuxedo jacket bunched awkwardly around his shoulders, and dragged him roughly back through the swinging doors into the main VIP suite. The scene inside the lounge was equally chaotic. 2 agents had already cornered Catherine. She was thrashing wildly, her designer gown tearing at the delicate seam as she violently resisted arrest. She shrieked that they were making a terrible mistake, screaming that she was a prominent philanthropist and a vital pillar of the Chicago elite. The agents remained entirely unmoved by her hysterical entitlement. They forcefully twisted her arms behind her back, securely locking a pair of handcuffs around her manicured wrists. The lead federal agent stepped confidently into the center of the room. He did not care about their vast wealth or their prestigious social standing. He looked directly at the restrained couple and began to formally read them their Miranda rights in a booming, authoritative voice. He informed William and Catherine Davies that they were officially under arrest. He listed the staggering federal charges with cold, clinical precision, citing massive tax evasion, felony wire fraud, and the gross misappropriation of federal funds. He specifically added aggravated identity theft, gesturing directly toward the thick stack of official credit reports I still held firmly in my hand. He coldly advised them that they had the right to remain silent and that absolutely anything they said could and would be used against them in a court of law. The physical reality of the tight handcuffs and the severe federal charges finally breached Catherine's towering wall of delusion. The terrifying prospect of spending the rest of her natural life locked inside a federal penitentiary completely snapped her fragile allegiance to her husband. Pure, selfish panic entirely consumed her. As the lead agent finished reciting their constitutional rights, Catherine frantically tried to throw William under the bus to save her own skin. She violently twisted her head toward the federal agent, her eyes wide with desperate manufactured innocence. She screamed that she had absolutely nothing to do with the stolen money. Catherine wailed that the hidden offshore accounts, the decades of tax evasion, and the massive insurance fraud were entirely William's brilliant, twisted idea. She sobbed hysterically, portraying herself as a clueless, obedient wife who simply signed the complicated financial documents her abusive husband placed in front of her. She shrieked that William was the sole calculating mastermind who had manipulated her, demanding immediate release from the federal agents because she was just an innocent victim of his greed. William, panting heavily while firmly restrained, stared at his wife. The ultimate devastating betrayal violently twisted his sweating features into a hideous mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. If she was dragging him into the federal prison system, he was ensuring she burned right beside him in the center of the inferno. William yanked his head up, his face purple with absolute rage, completely revealing their darkest, most horrific secret. "I didn't ever light the goddamn match," William loudly roared at her. "You did, Catherine. You knocked the heavy heater over on purpose to hide Courtney's illegal drug stash from the local police." William's explosive confession hung in the cold air like toxic smoke. The federal agents did not hesitate. They shoved his rigid body forward, his wrists bound tightly behind his back in heavy steel cuffs, and marched him aggressively toward the service elevator. Catherine shrieked like a wounded banshee, kicking her expensive heels wildly as two agents forcefully dragged her across the plush carpet. She cursed William with vicious screams, her voice cracking violently as the heavy mahogany doors finally slammed shut behind them. The sudden suffocating silence in the VIP suite was deafening. The untouchable Davies empire had officially fallen. I stood completely still, watching the chaotic dust settle over the ruined room. Courtney was now entirely alone. Her corrupt parents were gone. Her stolen fortune was seized, and her ambitious husband had stripped off his wedding ring. The crushing reality of her total isolation crashed down upon her shoulders. She collapsed onto the floor, her knees hitting the carpet with a heavy thud. She crawled toward me, her designer silk gown tangling around her trembling legs. She reached out her manicured fingers, hovering just inches from my shoes. Courtney tilted her head back, unleashing a torrent of ugly, desperate sobs. She begged me to call off the federal agents. She pleaded with me to use my immense wealth to stop the ongoing investigation. Courtney rapidly weaponized her tears, frantically trying to play the innocent victim one final time. She shrieked that she was only a foolish, naive teenager when the devastating fire happened 15 years ago. She wailed that she was terrified of our dominating mother, desperately claiming Catherine had violently manipulated her into keeping quiet about my survival. Courtney sobbed that she had no choice but to go along with the massive insurance fraud because she was just a frightened, helpless kid trying to protect her fractured family. She reached forward and desperately grabbed the delicate hem of my emerald dress. She begged me to remember our shared blood and our childhood memories. She cried out that we were sisters, insisting that we were the very last remaining family each other had left in this cold world. Courtney choked heavily on her tears, screaming that she had absolutely nowhere left to go. Her offshore bank accounts were completely frozen, her platinum credit cards were permanently canceled, and her elite social standing was utterly obliterated. She pleaded wildly for a second chance, frantically promising to make things right. She swore blindly that she would spend the rest of her miserable life making up for the horrific betrayals of the past. She looked up at me with wide, bloodshot eyes, desperately hoping to find a tiny shred of familial loyalty or sibling compassion. I looked down at the pathetic, weeping woman violently clutching my dress. I felt absolutely nothing. I experienced zero pity, zero sympathy, and absolutely no sisterly bond. I smoothly stepped backward, forcing her trembling hands to drop heavily to the floor. I told Courtney in a low, icy voice that merely sharing genetic DNA did not make us sisters. I firmly reminded her that she had deliberately spent the last 15 years shopping in Paris and renewing luxurious country club memberships using the staggering wealth stained with my blood. I stated clearly and unequivocally that she was never a manipulated victim. I told her she was a willing, eager, and greedy participant in my attempted murder and the subsequent theft of my entire identity. I completely turned my attention away from her sobbing form and looked directly at Donovan. He was standing motionless by the mahogany bar, still staring blankly at the heavy gold wedding band resting on the polished wooden surface. I told Donovan that his wife's insatiable greed was not a relic of her teenage years. I explained that her sociopathic ambition had only sharpened and matured with age. I reached into my emerald clutch one final devastating time. I pulled out a thick black leather folder. I walked across the silent room and held it out directly toward him. Donovan stared at the black folder, his jaw tightening. He took it from my hands and flipped the cover open. I instructed him to look closely at the specific dates and the listed primary beneficiaries. I explained that exactly 3 weeks ago, shortly after Donovan announced his senatorial campaign, Courtney had initiated a covert financial transaction. She attempted to take out a secret $40 million life insurance policy on his life. I watched the blood drain from Donovan's face as his eyes scanned the printed legal documents. I pointed a single finger directly at the name of the independent insurance broker listed at the bottom of the lengthy policy application. I told Donovan it was the exact same corrupt broker her criminal parents had utilized 15 years ago to process my fraudulent death certificate. Courtney had deliberately bypassed Donovan's entire private security team and his meticulous campaign managers to quietly secure the massive policy without his knowledge or consent. She was betting everything on his rising political star. Donovan's hands began to shake violently. The crisp papers rattled in his white-knuckled grip. The horrifying reality of the documents hit him with the destructive force of a freight train. He looked at the staggering $40 million payout. He looked at the highly specific clauses regarding accidental death and tragedies. Then he slowly turned his head to look at the woman kneeling on the floor. Courtney had stopped crying. She was staring at the black folder, her eyes wide with paralyzing terror. Donovan realized that his beautiful, outwardly supportive wife was not planning to stand faithfully by his side during his stressful senatorial run. He realized that she was coldly calculating his exact peak market value. The chilling, undeniable truth washed over his gray, horrified features. Once his political career reached its zenith, once his name was plastered across national headlines and his public value was firmly established, Courtney was going to murder him. The paralyzing silence in the room stretched into eternity as Donovan stared at the $40 million life insurance policy in his shaking hands. The heavy black ink spelling out the massive death benefit seemed to burn directly into his retinas. For years, Donovan had believed he was building a genuine partnership with a woman who shared his ambitious vision for the future. He came from a proud, fiercely hardworking African-American family from the South Side. His parents and grandparents had fought relentlessly for every single scrap of success, teaching him the absolute value of integrity, sweat, and unimpeachable honor. He had bled for his political career, shaking hands, kissing babies, and fighting for his community. Now, looking at the forged signatures and the malicious clauses hidden within the black leather folder, the sickening truth finally shattered his meticulously planned world. He realized with absolute clarity that he was never a husband to Courtney Davies. He was nothing but a convenient political pawn, a respectable prop to mask their generational corruption and ultimately a massive future paycheck. The Davies family did not build wealth. They extracted it from the blood and bones of everyone around them, and Donovan was next on their slaughterhouse list. Courtney scrambled across the plush carpet, her expensive silk gown tangling around her knees as she abandoned her pathetic pleas to me. She threw her body at Donovan's feet, her manicured hands desperately clawing at the perfectly tailored fabric of his suit trousers. She looked up at him with wide, mascara-stained eyes, frantically attempting to deploy the same manipulative charm that had ensnared him years ago. She choked out rapid, desperate lies, weeping that the massive insurance policy was just a standard administrative procedure. She shrieked that her corrupt father had forced her to sign the paperwork, claiming it was merely aggressive financial planning to protect their future children and secure his political legacy. Courtney sobbed violently, clutching his legs and begging him to remember their wedding vows. She pleaded that she loved him deeply, swearing on her life that she would never actually hurt him. She begged him to use his political influence and his legal connections to stop the federal agents from destroying her life. She wailed that they were a team, a unified front, and that he could not abandon his beautiful wife when she needed him the most. Donovan looked down at the weeping, hysterical woman clinging to his legs. The absolute disgust radiating from his dark eyes was infinitely colder and more terrifying than any shouting match could ever be. He did not pull away immediately. He simply stared at her with a chilling clinical detachment, observing her like a poisonous insect trapped under a microscope. He spoke in a dangerously low, remarkably steady voice that cut right through her pathetic sobbing. He told Courtney that his grandfather had marched for civil rights, and his mother had worked 3 minimum-wage jobs just to put him through law school. He proudly stated that his family knew the actual meaning of loyalty and sacrifice. He coldly informed her that she was a parasitic monster who had gladly worn the stolen skin of her burned sister to fund her luxury shopping sprees. Donovan stated unequivocally that she had systematically infected his clean campaign with her family's dirty money, using his hard-earned reputation to launder their stolen millions. He told Courtney that he would rather burn his entire political career to the ground than spend another single second breathing the same air as a treacherous, murdering sociopath. Donovan finally stepped backward violently, wrenching his suit trousers out of her desperate grip. Courtney collapsed flat against the carpet, wailing in sheer agony as her final lifeline completely evaporated. Donovan did not spare her another glance. He turned his broad shoulders and walked purposefully toward the lead FBI agent overseeing the raid. He moved with the undeniable authority of a man who had entirely reclaimed his stolen dignity. Donovan introduced himself formally, his voice echoing clearly through the ruined VIP suite. He reached into his tailored breast pocket and retrieved an encrypted titanium flash drive. He held the silver drive out to the federal agent, stating clearly that it contained the unredacted comprehensive financial ledgers for his entire senatorial campaign. He explicitly informed the FBI that William and Catherine Davies had been using a complex web of shell companies and fake political action committees to illegally launder millions of dollars in stolen funds through his campaign accounts. Donovan offered his absolute unconditional cooperation with the federal authorities. He volunteered to testify in open court, promising to hand over every single password server log and hidden email exchange required to nail the entire Davies family to the wall. The lead agent accepted the flash drive, nodding with a deep, silent respect for Donovan's immediate and unwavering cooperation. Donovan smoothed the lapels of his suit, his posture completely rigid as he looked back at the sobbing wreckage of his former wife. He locked eyes with the federal agents and pointed a steady finger directly at Courtney. He formally requested that they place her under immediate arrest for conspiracy wire fraud and attempted murder. The agents did not need to be told twice. 2 heavily armed officers swiftly advanced on the weeping woman. They yanked Courtney roughly off the floor, grabbing her wrists and forcefully twisting them behind her back. The sharp mechanical click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around her wrists sounded like a final definitive judgment. Courtney screamed in pure, unadulterated terror, thrashing wildly against the unyielding grip of the federal agents. Her custom designer silk gown ripped audibly along the side seam, completely destroying the glamorous, untouchable image she had weaponized for 15 long years. The officers hauled her toward the exit, dragging the struggling socialite out of the luxurious suite to join her parents in federal custody. Donovan stood absolutely still, watching his fake marriage disappear forever into the dark. The VIP suite doors swung shut, leaving behind the remnants of the Davies dynasty. The federal agents wasted no time. They maintained an unyielding grip on the disgraced socialites, marching them through the hotel corridors with clinical efficiency. The FBI tactical strike team boots thudded rhythmically against the thick carpets. William stumbled forward, his head bowed low, his arrogant posture entirely broken. He looked like a hollow shell of a man, his expensive tuxedo jacket hanging awkwardly, sharp handcuffs dug into his wrists, tethering him to his crimes. Courtney was entirely unresponsive. She dragged her feet, breathing erratically. Her custom silk gown hung in ruined strips around her ankles, a physical manifestation of her dismantled facade. She kept her face angled downward, trying to hide her tear-streaked makeup from the hotel staff, watching the procession in stunned silence. Catherine violently refused to surrender her delusions. She attempted to adjust her posture, straining against the agents. She hissed at the officers, demanding respect suited to her tax bracket. The agents ignored her entitled demands, pushing the trio toward the private elevator. The descent to the ground floor was agonizingly slow, the cramped cabin filled with the suffocating stench of panic, expensive perfume, and cold sweat. When the polished brass doors slid open to reveal the grand lobby, an explosion of blinding white light consumed the space. My public relations team had executed my instructions with flawless precision. Over 50 journalists, local news anchors, and national correspondents completely choked the massive lobby. They barricaded the main exit, their heavy camera rigs transforming the elegant space into an aggressive media circus. A deafening roar of shouted questions washed over the FBI escort. Microphones bearing the logos of major news networks were aggressively thrust forward, completely blocking the path to the waiting armored transport vehicles. The sheer volume of the press swarm caused the federal agents to momentarily halt their advance, physically shielding the handcuffed prisoners from the crushing wave of reporters. Courtney whimpered, raising her hands to shield her swollen face from the flashing cameras. William squeezed his eyes shut, wishing the marble floor would swallow him whole. Catherine immediately seized the chaotic moment. Her survival instinct flared, and she desperately attempted to control the narrative. She wrenched her shoulders back, throwing her head high as she glared directly into the primary television camera lens. She ignored the heavy steel restraints binding her wrists and projected her voice with practiced, aristocratic indignation. Catherine shouted over the deafening press, aggressively declaring that the federal raid was a massive, highly coordinated political witch hunt. She shrieked that the ruthless authorities were solely targeting her innocent family to maliciously destroy her son-in-law's rising senatorial campaign. She loudly labeled the FBI agents as corrupt political operatives, insisting the Davies family was a respected philanthropic pillar of the Chicago community and would be fully exonerated of these fabricated charges. She demanded the immediate release of her terrified daughter, claiming Courtney was the victim of a vicious political smear campaign. Catherine stared fiercely into the flashing lights, hoping her performance would manipulate the watching public. Her calculated performance lasted exactly 30 seconds. I stepped out of the secondary VIP elevator behind the chaotic scene, walking with a calm, predatory grace. The loud clicking of my heels on the marble flooring somehow cut through the deafening noise of the aggressive press pool. I moved smoothly through the tactical presence, stepping directly into the center of the blinding flashbulbs. I did not hide my face. I stood incredibly tall, my emerald dress catching the intense studio lights, projecting an image of absolute, unshakable power. The overwhelming roar of the journalists instantly died down as I raised a single commanding hand. I looked directly into the primary national broadcast camera and formally introduced myself. I stated that my name was Lauren, the current chief executive officer of a highly successful independent venture capital firm. I let that undeniable fact hang in the air for a fraction of a second before delivering the ultimate devastating truth. I looked directly at Catherine's horrified face and then turned back to the captive press. I announced to the national media that I was the exact same daughter Catherine and William Davies had officially declared dead 15 years ago. I stated with absolute, unwavering clarity that I was the sole survivor of a deliberate, malicious arson attempt orchestrated by my own biological sister to hide her illegal drug trafficking. I informed the silent reporters that my parents had subsequently committed massive federal insurance fraud, falsely claiming a $3 million payout on my fabricated death. I clearly explained that Catherine Davies had spent the last decade and a half aggressively committing felony identity theft, using my stolen social security number to fund her extravagant lifestyle. I watched the color completely drain from Catherine's face as my words systematically annihilated her pathetic political witch hunt narrative. The camera operators immediately pivoted, zooming in on the utterly destroyed expressions of the Davies family as the colossal, horrifying truth of their generational corruption was broadcast live into millions of homes. Miles away, the arraignment judge sat motionless behind his desk. He watched the extraordinary broadcast playing on his monitor. He listened to my testimony, absorbing the magnitude of the financial crimes. He observed William's silence, Courtney's torn gown, and Catherine's shattered facade. He recognized the flight risk posed by a family possessing offshore accounts and a history of deception. He did not wait for formal proceedings. Disgusted by the evil radiating from the broadcast, he picked up his pen. He pulled the indictment paperwork toward him and signed his name with conviction. He officially denied bail for all three defendants. William, Catherine, and Courtney Davies were going straight into the freezing concrete cells of the maximum security federal penitentiary. They were now permanently stripped of their vast stolen wealth, their unearned freedom, and their carefully fabricated lives. True justice had finally arrived to claim them all tonight. The morning sun cast cold shadows across the manicured driveway of the Davies mansion. The sprawling estate was the ultimate symbol of my family's generational wealth and unyielding power. Now it was legally mine. The federal courts had moved with unprecedented speed, freezing every asset tied to the offshore accounts and returning the property deed to its rightful owner. As I pulled my car through the towering gates, I immediately noticed a battered moving van parked haphazardly on the front lawn. The engine was idling loudly, sending thick plumes of gray exhaust into the crisp air. Two rough-looking men were hurriedly loading heavy cardboard boxes into the back. The judge had explicitly denied bail the night before, but money always finds a loophole. Courtney had somehow secured a temporary release just hours before dawn, utilizing a sleazy bail bondsman who operated entirely in the gray areas of the legal system. Her parents remained locked in maximum security, but Courtney had bolted straight back to the scene of her crimes. I stepped out of my car, flanked by a team of 4 forensic auditors and 2 armed private security contractors. I pushed open the heavy front doors and walked into a scene of absolute chaos. The grand foyer looked like the aftermath of a violent burglary. Courtney was sprinting frantically between the formal dining room and the grand staircase. She was dressed in baggy gray sweatpants and a stained shirt, a stark contrast to the custom gown she had torn the night before. Her bare feet slapped loudly against the imported Italian marble. She was shoving anything of value into large canvas bags with frantic movements. Expensive silver platters, crystal vases, and antique clocks were being tossed carelessly together. When she heard my heels click against the floor, she froze. She dropped a heavy silver candlestick, the metal clattering sharply. Her sunken, bloodshot eyes darted wildly around the room like a trapped animal. Courtney immediately went on the offensive, weaponizing her panic into screeching hostility. She pointed a trembling finger at my face and screamed that I had absolutely no right to be inside her home. She yelled at the movers to keep loading the van, frantically attempting to pack a stack of framed abstract oil paintings and a velvet box overflowing with diamond bracelets. She shrieked that these were her personal belongings and that the federal freeze did not apply to her curated art collection. She clutched a stack of limited edition designer handbags to her chest, her knuckles turning bone white as she backed toward the open doorway. She sobbed aggressively, claiming I had already destroyed her marriage and locked up her parents. She demanded I show her a single ounce of human decency and let her leave with the items that belonged exclusively to her. She insisted she was completely destitute and needed these valuables just to pay her sleazy bail bondsman. I did not raise my voice or match her hysterical energy. I signaled for my security contractors to immediately block the front entrance physically, cutting off the movers from carrying another box out to the idling van. The two rough-looking men took one glance at my armed escorts and wisely backed away, dropping their cargo onto the floor. Courtney shrieked at them to pick the bags up, but they refused to move. I walked slowly across the grand foyer, stopping just a few feet away from my hyperventilating sister. I looked at the massive pile of luxury goods she was desperately trying to smuggle off the property. I turned back to Courtney and delivered the crushing reality of her situation. I told her that she was absolutely correct about the federal asset freeze. The government had seized the offshore account stock portfolios and real estate. However, I explained that the items she was currently holding did not belong to the federal government. I signaled to the lead auditor behind me. The auditor stepped forward and handed me a thick ledger. I flipped the heavy book open and held the pages up to the morning light. I told Courtney that my financial team had spent the last 48 hours doing a comprehensive trace on every single transaction involving the credit cards opened under my stolen Social Security number. I read aloud the specific purchase dates, the exact vendor names, and the staggering monetary values. I pointed to the stack of abstract oil paintings leaning against the wall and read the corresponding receipt from a high-end Parisian gallery. I pointed to the velvet box of diamond bracelets and read the transaction log from an exclusive Swiss jeweler. I pointed directly at the designer handbags clutched desperately against her chest and read off the exact retail prices charged to a platinum card bearing my stolen identity. I looked Courtney dead in the eyes and stated with absolute finality that she had not purchased a single item in this room with her own money. I slammed the ledger shut, the crack echoing loudly through the foyer. Because every piece of art jewelry and designer bag was purchased using fraudulent credit lines attached to my stolen identity, they were legally my exclusive property. She had essentially been doing my personal shopping for 15 years. Courtney gasped, her mouth falling open in sheer horror. She slowly, painfully realized that her meticulous packing, her desperate dawn escape, and her frantic scramble for survival funds had been completely pointless. I turned to my security team and gave a single nod. The contractors moved forward and firmly pulled the designer bags out of Courtney's rigid arms. The auditors swarmed the room, cataloging every item she had attempted to steal and officially seizing the moving van. Courtney stood trembling in the center of the marble floor, stripped of her stolen wealth and counterfeit identity. I pointed silently toward the open front door. She stumbled blindly down the driveway, forced to leave the estate with absolutely nothing but the sweatpants she was wearing. The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung shut, sealing off the media circus outside. 3 weeks passed since the humiliating eviction of Courtney from the estate, and the reality of the criminal justice system had finally caught up with William and Catherine Davies. They sat at the polished mahogany defense table, their federal prison jumpsuits a glaring contrast to the custom tailoring they had hidden behind for decades. Their wrists were shackled to the table. The presiding judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for elite theatrics, peered down from the bench. She formally read the staggering list of federal indictments, including wire fraud conspiracy to commit murder and generational money laundering. When asked for their plea, William stood up. His voice lacked its usual booming authority, but the arrogant defiance remained perfectly intact. He locked his cold eyes directly on me in the gallery and pleaded not guilty. Catherine immediately echoed his plea, tilting her chin up in a desperate, pathetic attempt to maintain her shattered dignity. Their expensive defense attorney, a ruthless corporate litigator named Arthur Vance, immediately launched his aggressive counteroffensive. He stood up, buttoning his pristine suit jacket, and ignored the forensic accounting evidence the prosecution had submitted. Vance turned his predatory gaze toward the gallery and pointed a sharp finger directly at me. He loudly declared to the judge that the entire federal case rested on a spectacular, highly coordinated fabrication. He stated confidently that his clients were the tragic, enduring victims of an unthinkable family loss. Vance claimed that I was an opportunistic imposter, a highly sophisticated con artist who had undergone extensive plastic surgery to perfectly mimic their deceased daughter. He argued that I had fabricated the offshore financial trails and orchestrated the raids simply to steal their massive cash estate. He painted William and Catherine as grieving parents being maliciously terrorized by a psychotic look-alike. Vance demanded that the judge throw the entire case out immediately, calling the federal investigation a gross miscarriage of justice built entirely on the lies of a greedy phantom. I did not flinch under the aggressive theatrical assault from Vance. The federal prosecutor simply nodded to the judge and officially called me to the witness stand. I stood up from the wooden gallery bench, smoothing my suit, and walked confidently past the defense table. I felt the venomous glare from William burning into my back, but I did not give him the satisfaction of looking his way. I placed my hand on the Bible, swore to tell the absolute truth, and sat down in the witness box. The prosecutor handed the judge a sealed manila envelope. I stated for the official court record that the envelope contained a verified legal DNA test conducted by an independent federal laboratory exactly 2 days prior. I explained that the genetic sequencing undeniably matched the biological markers kept on file from my birth, proving with absolute scientific certainty that I was the biological daughter of William and Catherine Davies. Vance scoffed loudly from the defense table. He immediately objected, claiming that DNA records could be easily hacked, manipulated, or fabricated by someone with enough venture capital funding and illicit connections. He insisted that genetic paperwork was entirely insufficient to prove my identity against the sworn testimony of my own grieving parents. I looked directly at Vance, watching his smug, overpaid arrogance fill the silent courtroom. I reached for the top button of my silk blouse. I told the judge that while digital records might be subject to debate by desperate defense attorneys, physical reality was entirely immutable. I smoothly unbuttoned the collar and slipped the fabric off my left shoulder, pulling it down to expose my upper back and collarbone to the completely silent courtroom. The horrific, jagged burn scars stretched across my skin like a violent, deeply etched map of my survival. The thick, discolored tissue was a permanent, undeniable testament to the inferno my sister had trapped me inside 15 years ago. A collective gasp echoed through the gallery. Even the stoic judge visibly recoiled at the sheer severity of the permanent damage. I did not look away. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a stack of yellowed, fragile documents. I handed them directly to the bailiff. I stated for the record that these were the original unclassified hospital admission files for a Jane Doe admitted to the county burn ward on the exact night the Davies family estate caught fire. I explained that the highly specific, deeply etched scar patterns mapped out in the older medical diagrams perfectly matched the permanent disfigurement currently visible on my body. I told the court that William and Catherine had deliberately left me to burn, and when I miraculously survived, they left me to rot as an unidentified ward of the state while they cashed a $3 million life insurance check. Vance stared at the yellowed medical records now projected onto the courtroom monitors. He looked at the precise, unquestionable medical diagrams, and then he looked at the devastating corresponding scars permanently carved into my shoulder. The arrogant smirk completely vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden, paralyzing realization. He slowly turned his head to look at William. William was staring at the floor, his face drained of all color, completely unable to meet the eyes of his attorney. Vance realized in that exact horrifying second that his wealthy, prestigious client had lied to him about absolutely everything. William had knowingly set his own defense attorney up to present a fraudulent, perjured narrative in federal court. The color rushed to the cheeks of Vance in a furious, panicked wave. The severe legal and professional consequences of submitting a false defense crashed down upon him. Vance abruptly slammed his legal pad shut and stood up, interrupting the prosecutor mid-sentence. He looked directly at the presiding judge, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. He formally requested to withdraw as counsel for the Davies family, effective immediately. The heavy courtroom doors had barely swung shut behind Arthur Vance before the grim reality of the situation crashed down upon the Davies family. the presiding judge, visibly disgusted by the overwhelming evidence of perjury and the horrifying revelation of my permanent scars, did not hesitate to grant the immediate withdrawal of their expensive defense attorney. William and Catherine were unceremoniously hauled back to the subterranean holding cells of the federal penitentiary, their wrists shackled and their fraudulent empire rapidly disintegrating. The sterile, freezing concrete walls of the maximum security facility were a violent departure from the silk sheets and imported marble they had enjoyed for the last 15 years. Yet despite the catastrophic collapse of his legal defense and the undeniable proof of his heinous crimes, William clung desperately to his trademark arrogance. He paced the narrow length of his cell like a caged predator, his mind calculating his next malicious move. He genuinely believed he was untouchable. He believed that the federal asset freeze only covered the domestic accounts the FBI already knew about. He still had his ultimate insurance policy. Using his single legally mandated phone call, William did not reach out to a new defense attorney or a bail bondsman. His towering ego demanded a psychological victory. He needed to reassert his dominance and remind me that he was the apex predator of the Davies family. He bribed a sympathetic guard with the promise of future wealth to secure a private, unmonitored line. Standing in the dimly lit corridor of the holding block, gripping the heavy plastic receiver of the jailhouse phone, he dialed my personal cell phone number. I answered on the second ring, sitting at the polished glass conference table of my venture capital firm, fully expecting his desperate outreach. The line crackled with static before William's voice echoed through the speaker. It was dripping with the same smug, condescending venom he had used to terrorize me during my childhood. William immediately launched into a vicious, arrogant monologue, his words laced with undeniable malice. He laughed darkly, mocking my courtroom display as nothing more than cheap, pathetic theater. He told me that showing my scars was a desperate plea for sympathy from a gullible judge, but it fundamentally changed nothing about the power dynamic between us. He arrogantly proclaimed that while I might have won a minor skirmish by scaring off Arthur Vance, the overarching war was dictated entirely by capital, and his capital was absolutely infinite. He swore he would hire the most ruthless, ethically bankrupt fixers on the planet. He threatened to drag the upcoming criminal trial and civil litigation out for decades, drowning me in endless appeals, relentless injunctions, and retaliatory lawsuits until my venture capital firm bled completely dry. William bragged openly about his untouchable offshore accounts, the hidden shell corporations operating out of the Cayman Islands, and the massive untraceable rainy day fund that the federal investigators had completely missed during their raid. He promised to use every single cent of that hidden money to destroy my reputation, dismantle my business, and ensure I spent the rest of my miserable life looking over my shoulder. I listened in absolute silence, letting him exhaust his toxic breath. I did not interrupt his pathetic, delusion-fueled rant. When he finally paused, expecting me to cower or retaliate with emotional anger, I simply leaned back in my leather chair. My voice was ice-cold, devoid of any familial warmth or lingering fear. I told William that his overconfidence had always been his most fatal flaw. I calmly recited the exact legal names of his 3 primary offshore shell companies, listing their routing numbers and the specific names of his corrupt Swiss bankers. The line went dead silent. I explained to my biological father that he had severely underestimated the capabilities of the daughter he had tried to burn alive. I informed him that while he was busy parading around elite Chicago charity galas and grooming Donovan for political extortion, my financial analysts had been relentlessly tracking the complex laundering vectors he and Catherine had established. I delivered the ultimate devastating payload with surgical precision. I told William that exactly 3 months ago, utilizing a proxy conglomerate, my venture capital firm had executed a rapid, hostile takeover of the parent holding company, shielding his offshore wealth. I explained that the labyrinth of shell corporations he thought was impenetrable had been legally acquired, dissolved, and liquidated. The massive, untraceable fortune he was currently bragging about had been legally seized frozen by international banking authorities and repatriated to cover the massive damages resulting from his insurance fraud. I stated clearly and unequivocally that the accounts held a zero balance. There was no hidden reserve. There was no secret war chest. His infinite capital was gone. I told William that the money he had stolen with my life was now firmly back under my control. I hung up the phone without waiting for a response, severing the connection and cutting him out of my life for good. In the freezing holding cell corridor, William stood absolutely paralyzed. The rhythmic dial tone buzzed harshly against his ear, sounding like a flat line. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, pallid gray. The horrifying magnitude of his total failure crushed the breath from his lungs. The heavy plastic receiver slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering violently against the concrete wall before dangling limply by its metal cord. William stared blankly at the rusted bars of his cell. His sprawling financial empire was gone. His influential friends had abandoned him, and his secret wealth had been entirely conquered by the daughter he had discarded. He realized with absolute suffocating dread that he was completely and utterly destitute. There would be no expensive fixers or miraculous legal rescues. He was now going to face a federal judge, a lifetime prison sentence, and the wrath of the justice system with nothing but a court-appointed public defender. The echoing click of the disconnected line in William's ear perfectly mirrored the devastating permanent silence settling over the entire Davies family. Miles away from the freezing concrete holding cells, I remained seated at the head of my polished glass conference table. The sprawling Chicago skyline stretched out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, a glittering monument to the empire I had built from absolute ashes. I did not move. I inherently knew the toxic psychological warfare was not over. William had blindly attempted to leverage his arrogance, but I knew Catherine would inevitably weaponize her maternal title against me. My phone violently vibrated against the polished glass surface exactly an hour later. The caller identification clearly displayed an incoming connection from the local federal correctional facility. I reached out slowly and tapped the digital screen silently, accepting the automated charges. Catherine did not wait for me to speak. She launched into a performance worthy of a stage, sobbing hysterically into the receiver. The harsh, sterile acoustics of the jailhouse phone could not mask the sheer desperation radiating from her voice. She wailed my name, dragging out the syllables with practiced anguish. She cried that the conditions in the penitentiary were barbaric, insisting she was a delicate woman who could not survive in a concrete box. When her complaints about the prison environment failed to elicit a response, Catherine immediately shifted her strategy. She pivoted to the ultimate emotionally abusive guilt trip she had hoarded for decades. She wept loudly, demanding that I remember the sacred bond of blood. She shrieked that she had carried me in her womb for 9 months, sacrificing her body and her youth to give me life. She swore blindly that a mother and daughter shared an unbreakable biological connection that no court order could ever sever. Catherine dramatically choked on her own manufactured tears, her grating voice dropping to a frantic begging whisper. She desperately pleaded with me to look deep into my heart and find a tiny shred of familial mercy. She shamelessly begged me to call my high-powered lawyers and immediately instruct them to negotiate a generous leniency agreement. She frantically promised she would quietly disappear, swore she would never bother me again, and stubbornly insisted that locking her away was an unforgivable sin against human nature. She aggressively demanded I finally act like the dutiful, profoundly loving daughter she falsely claimed she had always raised me to be. I sat perfectly still, letting the silence stretch across the phone line until her frantic sobbing devolved into anxious, ragged breathing. I felt no pity. I experienced zero loyalty. I pressed my lips toward the speaker and spoke in a voice composed of unbreakable ice. I firmly informed Catherine that she lost the right to call herself my mother the night she lit a match and walked away. I told her that I knew exactly what mercy felt like. I explained that I had learned the true definition of mercy while lying completely paralyzed in the sterile, agonizing burn ward of the county hospital. I recounted how I had forcefully bitten through my own lower lip to keep from screaming, while the trauma surgeons aggressively scrubbed the dead, charred skin off my back and shoulders with stiff wire brushes. I stated coldly that mercy was the morphine that finally pulled me under when the physical agony became too spectacular for a human mind to endure. I listened to Catherine gasp sharply on the other end of the line, but I absolutely refused to stop. I told her that my survival was not a miracle. I stated unequivocally that my survival was fueled by one singular crystal-clear memory from the night of the fire. I painted the picture for her, describing the suffocating black smoke and the roaring heat of the flames consuming the grand staircase. I reminded Catherine that she had stood at the top of the landing perfectly safe and entirely untouched by the inferno. I described the exact moment the wooden stairs collapsed beneath my feet, sending me plunging backward into the blazing pit. I told her that I had looked up screaming for my mother to reach out and grab my hand. My voice dropped an octave, striking her with the precision of a lethal weapon. I informed Catherine that I saw her face in that critical life-defining second. She did not look panicked. She did not look horrified. I told her that she had smiled. I reminded her of the slight, satisfied upward curve of her lips as she watched her unwanted daughter fall into the fire. I stated firmly that her sickening, greedy smile was the foundation of my entire existence. That single expression of maternal evil had completely eradicated my childhood innocence and forged an unbreakable titanium core in its place. I told Catherine that her smile had built my venture capital empire, fueled my hostile takeovers, and orchestrated her permanent destruction. I informed her that there was no mercy left in my heart because she had gladly burned it out of me 15 years ago. I stated clearly that she was nothing more than a convicted felon, a stranger, and a ghost. I reached forward and tapped the red button on the screen. The call disconnected instantly, severing the toxic generational tie forever. I exhaled a slow, deeply cleansing breath. I stood up slowly from the conference table and walked calmly toward the massive windows. The television mounted on the far wall of my office was tuned to a national news network broadcasting silently. A bright red banner suddenly flashed across the bottom of the screen. I watched the breaking news chyron scroll rapidly. The text confirmed that William and Catherine Davies, facing insurmountable evidence and absolute financial ruin, had officially surrendered. They had formally accepted a binding plea deal for 20 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. I turned away from the screen, my revenge perfectly and beautifully complete. The crisp night air whipped across the expansive terrace of my Chicago penthouse. I stood near the edge of the glass railing, a steaming mug of black coffee warming my hands, and looked out over the glittering grid of the city skyline. The sprawling urban landscape below felt entirely different to me tonight. It was no longer a battlefield, a hostile territory to conquer, or a dark shadow to hide within. It was simply a beautiful, vibrant city, and I finally owned my rightful place at the absolute top of it. I took a deep, grounding breath, letting the freezing winter wind aggressively fill my lungs. For 15 grueling years, I had carried the suffocating heavy weight of my past, like a lead anchor permanently chained to my chest. I had spent a decade and a half meticulously calculating every single move, operating in the margins and channeling my profound trauma into relentless, focused ambition. The devastating fire that William, Catherine, and Courtney had so callously used to erase my existence was meant to reduce me to forgotten ash. Instead, that blazing inferno served as the ultimate defining crucible. The flames burned away every trace of the weak, desperate girl who only wanted her family to love her. The intense heat forged a woman made of impenetrable steel, fully capable of dismantling an entire corrupt dynasty piece by piece. My phone buzzed softly in the pocket of my cashmere trousers, breaking the quiet solitude of the balcony. It was a text message from Donovan, containing a single photograph and a triumphant exclamation point. The image showed him standing on a brightly lit stage, surrounded by cheering volunteers, and a flurry of red, white, and blue confetti. The grueling, chaotic election cycle had finally concluded an hour ago. Donovan had officially won his bid for the United States Senate, securing a sweeping, indisputable victory. His honorable path to the Capitol had been the absolute antithesis of the corrupt, manipulated coronation William had originally planned for him. After the devastating courtroom revelations and the total collapse of the Davies empire, Donovan had moved with ruthless efficiency to sever all ties with his fraudulent past. He filed for an immediate, heavily publicized divorce from Courtney legally, and publicly detaching himself from her toxic criminal legacy. He fully cooperated with federal investigators, providing vital documented testimony that helped dismantle the remaining fragments of William's illicit network, effectively clearing his own name and reputation in the process. Donovan built his Senate campaign from the ground up, relying entirely on grassroots organization, fierce transparency, and a platform of genuine reform. He flatly refused corporate dark money and completely rejected the shady political action committees that typically dominated local elections. My venture capital firm provided the crucial, strictly legitimate financial backing he needed to get his ambitious campaign off the ground. We operated with absolute audited transparency, proving definitively that power and influence could be wielded without resorting to political extortion or financial blackmail. Watching him claim his victory tonight, a free and honorable man, was the ultimate validation of our shared struggle. We had both been used as disposable pawns by the Davies family, but we had successfully and permanently rewritten our own destinies. While Donovan celebrated his massive political triumph under the flashing lights of the media cameras, my sister was experiencing a vastly different reality. Courtney was currently residing in a maximum security federal correctional facility in upstate New York, halfway through a mandatory 5-year sentence for identity theft, wire fraud, and severe financial conspiracy. Her elite curated world of private jets, imported Italian marble, and stolen designer handbags had been completely stripped away, rapidly replaced by depressing cinderblock walls and harsh fluorescent lights. Her daily reality now consisted of waking up at dawn to work her strictly assigned shift in the sweltering windowless prison laundry facility. The arrogant woman who had once ruthlessly mocked my existence and callously spent my stolen money was now spending her miserable days folding institutional jumpsuits and washing industrial linens for pennies an hour. She had no secret offshore accounts to bail her out, no wealthy parents to bribe a federal judge, and absolutely no golden child status left to protect her from the harsh, unforgiving consequences of her own devastating actions. I turned away from this breathtaking city view and stepped back inside the warmth of my penthouse. The massive living room was filled with the warm, comforting hum of genuine laughter and easy, relaxed conversation. My dedicated executive team, my brilliant forensic auditors, and the fiercely loyal friends who had stood securely by me during the darkest, most terrifying chapters of my life were gathered around the expansive kitchen island. We were joyously celebrating Donovan's incredible victory, but we were also celebrating a profound collective liberation from the past. As I walked toward them, passing a vibrant, abstract oil painting hanging beautifully on the gallery wall, I realized that I was completely free. I was profoundly wealthy, legally vindicated, and completely unbound from the toxic, suffocating shadow of the Davies family name. More importantly, I was safely surrounded by people who had actively earned their place in my life through unwavering loyalty, raw honesty, and shared battles. This was my true family. We were bound not by the random, unpredictable lottery of genetics, but by mutual respect and a shared unbreakable commitment to building something authentic. I gracefully stopped right at the edge of the room, proudly looking at the incredibly resilient, brilliant faces of my chosen family. I looked directly forward into a bright, limitless future ahead. Family is not blood. Blood just makes you related. Family is who runs into the fire for you, not who pushes you back in. If you have ever been the scapegoat, remember this. Do not just survive the flames. Own the ashes. Have you ever had to build an empire just to prove them wrong? Share your story down below in the comments section right now today.